African history: the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. The Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. The Mahdist Revolt was led by Mohammed Ahmed, who declared himself the expected Mahdi, the chosen one by God, in 1880 with the purpose of unifying all Sudanese against the foreign rule. Turco-Egyptians had ruled Sudan for a period of 60 years. From 1820–1860 they were developmental to Sudanese, but in successive eras up to 1880 they became exploitative, oppressive and suppressive, thus leading to emergence of Mahdist Revolt in 1881. The revolt appears to have a religious perspective because of its leadership, although it had a lot of political and economic effects. The Mahdi mobilized people along religious grievances, but the revolt didn't only get support from the Muslims. It was supported countrywide as the Turco-Egyptians' outcry had spread to all regions of Sudan. The fact that the Mahdist Revolt mobilized all the Sudanese, including North Sudanese Muslims, southern people, civil workers, commoners and the army, shows that there were many other causes of the revolt than religion. The revolt was a nationalistic one under the cover of religion. Causes of the revolt. These related around social, political and economic injustices subjected to the Sudanese by foreigners. Social causes. Anti-foreign cultures. Socially, the Sudanese were oppressed to Egyptian religious leaders, teachers and their leaders. The newcomers did not respect the Sudanese culture, that increased resentment against the foreign rule by the Sudanese masses. The Turco-Egyptians employed many young Europeans who were Christians. This increased the European Christian interference in the affairs of Sudan. The Christians didn't have any respect for Sudanese Islamic religion, and they were considered as infidels, non-believers. It is said they were corrupt, open wine drinkers, luxurious and arrogant, all of that resulted into the Mahdist Revolt. Religious discontent related to the above. The distinction between religious beliefs of foreigners and the Sudanese created religious resentment against the Turco-Egyptian government. These were sentiments that enabled Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdi to attract enough followers against the Turco-Egyptian government. Nevertheless, Mahdist uprising has support from all the Christians, all Muslims and pagans of Sudan, plus other classes of people irrespective of their religious differences, which confirms that Mahdist Revolt was quite nationalistic and only religious-oriented. The desire to Sudanize their administration led to the emergence of Mahdist Revolt in 1881. The Turco-Egyptian administration was corrupt and inefficient, and therefore did little to cater for the needs of the Sudanese. The educated Sudanese were not given jobs except those of lowest grades or of degrading nature, e.g. receptionists. African history: the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Among the political causes was the loss of independence. For a period of 60 years Sudanese were tied to the dictators of Turco-Egyptian leaders. The Mahdist Revolt was a result of popular desire for Sudan's need to regain their independence. Since 1820 the Sudanese had been ruled as conquered, excluded from the management of their government affairs. For a period of 60 years the Sudanese were tied to the dictators of Turco-Egyptian leaders. Political events in Egypt: by 1881, for instance, in 1879, Ismail was replaced by his son Tufik, who was a puppet leader to the joint Anglo-French administration in Egypt at the time. From 1879 to 1881, Egypt was effectively controlled by the British-French foreigners' Anglo-French administration, whose policies resulted into the Eurobeist uprising in Egypt in 1881. The British were no longer willing to spend money on Sudan, as much of their economic charges at this time were aimed at clearing off their debts from Egyptian economy. These events preoccupied the Egyptians and diverted their attentions from Sudan. At the same time were aimed at clearing off their debts from Egyptian economy. These events preoccupied the Egyptians and diverted their attentions from Sudan. At the same time, the crushing of Eurobeist revolt shattered the Egyptian superiority, which encouraged the Mahdist Revolt to rise up against the Turco-Egyptian administrators. The local administrators sent to Sudan from Egypt also tried as much as possible to benefit on their assignments by exploiting the country. This was partly because they were not sure of their posts, since transfers or dismissals were very common in Turco-Egyptian government. To benefit, therefore, each of them would try to exploit the area under his jurisdiction as much as possible. Political repressive system: the other nature of their administration was its repressiveness. Between 1820 and 1880 the Turco-Egyptian government had tried to maintain a large army, up to 10,000 infantry recruited from the Sudanese Negroes and about 900 in cavalry. These were for defending the Turco-Egyptian interests and machinery for repression against internal opposition. Khedive Ismail used this force to implement his policies, e.g. forced tax collection, forced Sudanese recruitment, etc. Economically, land alienation led to the revolt. Muhammad Ali and all his successors maintained the exploitation of Sudan. At least they all had a record of grabbing land from Sudanese for developing cotton-growing schemes on large scale, which caused discontent to Sudanese. These problems of land alienation contributed to the Mahdist uprising. Forced labor: the Sudanese were also forced to work in cotton plantations, roads and other public works. They were forced to transport cotton and timber for long distances. The Sudanese were forced to grow cotton, which was taken by Turco-Egyptian administrators at very low prices, and were forced to buy Egyptian goods, some of which were very expensive. This form of economic imperialism was responsible for the outbreak of Mahdist Revolt. Unfair taxation. The successors of Muhammad Ali, and particularly Ismail, tried to generate the revenue from Sudan in order to solve the financial difficulties at home. When the Egyptian treasury became bankrupt, the Turco-Egyptian government decided to overtax the Sudanese in order to meet the ever-increasing debts incurred by Ismail from European bankers. The methods of tax collection were equally brutal, because failure to pay tax meant confiscation of individuals' properties and sometimes mutilation of their body parts. The abolition of formerly slaves used to be the main trading item, but with the coming of Turco-Egyptian administrations in Sudan, slavery was abolished and ivory became a monopoly of Turco-Egyptian administrators, leaving no alternative source of revenue for the Sudanese. More to this, the Turk-Egyptian administrators. African history. The Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. The Mahdist state 1885–1898. By August 1884, Mahdist forces had controlled the whole of Sudan except in the extreme north and the south on the Red Sea coast and inside the walls of Khartoum, where Gordon found himself surrounded and in a great danger. In October, Britain sent a relief expedition under Colonel Stewart, who unfortunately arrived too late. On 25th January 1885, he and his men reached Khartoum, only to find that Gordon and his officers had been murdered 2 days earlier and the city had fallen to the forces of the Mahdi. Muhammad Ahmed became the political and religious leader in Sudan in 1885 after the defeat of the Turco-Egyptian rule. Unfortunately, he didn't live long to enjoy the fruits of his success. He died on 22nd June 1885 after a period of 3 months' rule. During his short rule, he enjoyed respect and popularity in the whole of Sudan. He tried to create a strong government built on Islamic ideas. He also reorganized the system of taxation and improved on the methods of tax collection. He reformed the system of justice based on Islamic laws. His main aim was to reform Islam in Sudan. He punished corruption, inefficiency, drunkenness, theft, and adultery. Indeed, Muhammad Ali tried to implement the ideas of his struggle religiously, although his administration had a sound political impact in the Sudanese. When he died, Sudan had already re-established her independence with a strong judicial system and an organized economy. It was this state of administration that he left in the hands of 3 caliphs, i.e. Abdullah, Ali, and Muhammad. Abdullah became superior to the other 2 and succeeded the throne. His regime was full of internal and external problems, which finally led to the collapse of the Mahdist state in 1898. Reasons for the success of the Mahdist Revolt. Able leadership. A cross-section of local populace welcomed Muhammad Ahmed. The Mahdi is a natural concept among Muslims to believe in people of their religion. He was a preacher and raised hopes of Sudanese by promising political, economic, and social reforms. His words fell on fertile brains as people were discontented of the Turco-Egyptian rule. He attracted support in almost all Sudanese major tribes, such as the Bakara cattle keepers, the Southern Kordofan and Darfini tribes. Section of propaganda literature. Muhammad Ahmed and his group used convincing words that naturally united the Sudanese behind a common cause. For example, they seriously condemned the unfair taxation policies, corruption, recruitment of Sudanese. African history. The Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Some time, but the war lacked a clear leadership. With the rising up of Muhammad Ahmed to champion the cause, all regions of Sudan, all classes rallied behind him, thus leading to success of the Mahdist Revolt. The coincidence of Mahdist uprising with Mahdist Revolt of Egypt in 1881. In 1881, Colonel Robi Pasha took the lead of Egyptian troops who were mainly engaged in war with the British at home, and when they were defeated in 1882, they lost respect of all sorts among the Sudanese, and hopes to maintain Sudan under the Turco-Egyptian rule faded. After the loss of the Egyptian independence to the British in 1882, the Turco-Egyptian administrators had little interest in events of Sudan. Impact of financial bankruptcy in Egypt. Kid of Ismail had borrowed a lot of money from European banks, especially France and Britain, and by 1879, the interest on borrowed amount has accumulated. By 1881, at the outbreak of Mahdist Revolt, Egypt was still servicing the foreign debt, which even increased pressure from European Economic Commission. Thus it was in a weak financial position to finance a war at that scale. Organizing and sending of regular expeditions to Sudan became hard, hence leading to the success of the Mahdist Revolt. Lack of foreign assistance. British government was quite reluctant to help the Egyptian government against the Sudanese, and Egypt couldn't appeal to Ethiopia for military assistance because of their historical conflict. The British Prime Minister supported the principle of self-government by the Sudanese. Under such circumstances, it became too costly in terms of money and manpower to defeat the Mahdist Revolt. Rule of Islam is a unifying factor. The Sudanese people used Islam as a tool of resistance. Regardless of the distinction in their beliefs, it was Islam which gave people strength, morale, courage, determination, and the sense of unity. The presence of common grievances and objectives of the rebellion made all the Sudanese to rally behind their Muslim leader, Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdist. The unique environment in Sudan. The weakness of the Egyptian side coupled with the hostile environment in Sudan made the Mahdist Revolt a success. The geography of the two countries was not exactly the same. The infrastructural setting was different, all of which provided an advantage to the Mahdist side. On top of this, war supplies in terms of arms, food and drinks were in short supply. There was lack of proper guidance from the local population, thus leading to Egyptian defeat. The Mahdist forces had military advantage over Turco-Egyptian army. They were well prepared, large in numbers. African history. The Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Forces of Mahdist and liberate the country from the hands of the Turco-Egyptian administrators. The Mahdist forces as well used the ambushes and the guerrilla war tactics which featured well against these foreigners. The port of metropolitan Britain. The public opinion in Britain changed in favour of the Sudanese freedom. The British Prime Minister supported the Sudanese self-rule, trying to capture their popularity as a country along the Nile Valley which Britain hoped to colonise with time, as the case happened in 1848 with the formation of the condominium government. The hatred of Tawfiq Nepotic government and his father Khedive Ismail. The Khartoum regime was internally divided. Most officials by the hated Khedive Ismail, who reversed the scale of their salaries in an attempt to meet the demands of the escalating debt. The local people were overtaxed, soldiers' privileges reduced, all of which demoralised the Turco-Egyptian forces. The coming in of his son as a new king of Egypt in 1879 worsened the situation. Causes of the Mahdist Revolt. The Mahdist Revolt was a struggle carried out by the Sudanese against foreign Turco-Egyptian rule. Some of the causes were political, religious, or economic. Politically, the Turco-Egyptian regime was characterized by considerable oppression and mismanagement/government. Many of the local administrators were engaged in corrupt and oppression were chronic features of the Turco-Egyptian rule. It was because of the maladministration and malpractices of the Turco-Egyptians that the Sudanese revolted. It's worthy nothing that with the employment of European Christians in important positions such as Gordon and Baker, there arose a belief that the country was going to be handed over to the Europeans. The situation was worsened by Gordon when, as Governor General, he took an active part in opposing the slave trade. Steps he took to punish slave traders disturbed the traditional economy of the Sudan and aroused bitter opposition. The fact that he employed increasing numbers of Europeans at administrative posts under him increased the bitterness. With all this taking place, a spirit of nationalism among the Sudanese rose. They therefore revolted. The Mahdist Revolt was also an attack on foreigners as a way of regaining lost sovereignty. Ever since the Sudan was conquered in 1820 by Muhammad Ali, the local people had regarded the established regime as alien and a sign of loss of social, political, and economic independence. Thus the Sudanese revolted to achieve self-determination. To crown it all, whatever sign of discontent that was shown by the Sudanese was suppressed with torture. The local Sudanese suffered so much that they all supported Muhammad Ahmed in revolt against the tortures. Religiously, a problem existed. The Turkish administrators belonged to the Hanafites school of Muslim law. The African history. The Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Coupled with the religious laxity, the religious feelings of the Sudanese were also disturbed by the employment of European Christians who were considered as infidels and not worthy governing them. In the 19th century, Sudan was a free Islamic area, and this brought about a tendency towards fanaticism, which encouraged more resentment against the non-Muslims. The religious concern of the Sudanese Muslims had been motivated by the successive jihads of the early 19th century in West Africa. The economic, social and political misery which the Sudanese were subjected to was seen by the devoted Muslims as a consequence of the moral degeneration, hence the revolt. Economically, the Sudanese were subjected to much economic exploitation. The Sudanese were heavily taxed. The inequitable system of taxation and the barbarous methods adopted in its collection had become an unbearable burden. Additionally, earlier attempts by Khedive Ismail and his foreign administrators to suppress slave trade struck at an important source of wealth to the Sudanese economy, and therefore stopping it meant masterminding its underdevelopment. There was also forced labour on cotton plantations and on the building of canals, dams and roads. Land grabbing from the Sudanese was also resented. Thus the Sudanese decided to strike at the Turco-Egyptians as quick means of getting rid of the massive economic exploitation. Another cause of the Mahdist Revolt has been associated with the philosophies of its leader Mohammed Ahmed. His philosophies provided the immediate motivation for revolt. In June 1881, he dispatched letters to all notable Sudanese. In the letter, he stated that he was the expected Mahdi, that is divine ruler sent by God to restore Islam and do away with Islam's impurity and corruption, partly because of this and largely because of his initiative. Muhammad Ahmed was able to provide leadership which attracted and united a large body of followers into staging a successful revolution against Turco-Egyptian rule. Other scholars have linked the outbreak of the Sudanese rebellion to the resignation of Charles George Gordon as Governor-General of Sudan when Khedive Ismail of Egypt was deposed in 1879. Gordon was not an ideal ruler. He was an oppressive and unpopular Christian ruler to the Sudanese. Thus his resignation following the overthrow of Khedive Ismail has been interpreted as having left behind an ideal situation for the Mahdists to exploit their advantage. This was particularly so because Gordon's successor Mohammed Rauf was too weak to effectively maintain the tone and trend of administration that the forceful Gordon had set in motion. For example, even after he had realized that the Mahdists were intriguing for rebellion, Rauf failed to suppress it in time. The Mahdists therefore got ample time to continue organizing themselves. By the time government tried to suppress them, it was too late. The Mahdists had already established themselves and the revolt was inevitable. The responsibility for the outbreak of the revolt can also be traced from what was transpiring in Egypt itself. Clearly, the reign of Khedive Ismail Pasha had ended in 1879 when he was deposed and replaced by his son, Tewfik. If Ismail was a weak ruler, then Tewfik proved to be even a weaker choice. He was a puppet of the great powers. The change of rulers, particularly in this, had removed the prestige which had surrounded the dynasty from the time of Muhammad Ali. In Egypt, the forces of opposition gathered around the army leader, Irabi Pasha, who effected a revolution in the center of power. The revolutionary changes made metropolitan control over the Sudanese province lukewarm. The Mahdi found its opportunity in the power control over the Sudanese vacuum created by the disappearance of Ismail's autocracy. When the power vacuum was promptly followed by Gordon's resignation, the Sudan was faced with a pretty good situation for revolt. The Turco-Egyptian conquest of Sudan, African history, the Madhi state, and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. The reasons for Muhammad Ali's conquest were serious. Muhammad wanted to create and expand the Egyptian empire. He also wished to have access to the gold mines he believed were in Sudan, to obtain the Negro slaves, to incorporate into his army, to obtain timber, to revitalize trade between Sudan and Egypt, to punish Mamluks who had established themselves in northern Sudan, and to exploit Sudan so as to solve the poverty in Egypt. Ali also claimed that he wanted to liberate the Sudanese from incessant civil wars, which characterized the Fungi administration. Results of Turco-Egyptian administration on Sudan. Turco-Egyptian rule in Sudan has been generally described as oppressive and exploitative. It has been pointed out that Muhammad Ali conquered the Sudan less to develop it than to exploit it. True, the Turco-Egyptian rule had negative impacts on the Sudan. Nevertheless, some of the consequences were positive. Among the results was the urbanization of the Sudan. In 1824, Khartoum was a mere village near the junction of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. But by 1833, it had expanded into an administrative capital of the country. Other towns that expanded included Omdurman and Port Sudan. There was also an improvement in transport and communication systems. A telegraph system was established which by 1866 linked towards Haifa and Upper Egypt. In 1874 this was extended to Khartoum. Another telegraph line was built linking Sudan to the Red Sea, and another extended westward through El Obeid to the borders of Darfur. Additionally, in Khedive Ismail's regime, a system of river steamers was developed on the Nile and a shipyard built at Khartoum. The government also financed service steamers on the Red Sea coast. The postal service was also taken over by the government and improved. Besides, there was increased flow of trade between Egypt and the Sudan. Though most benefits of the trade went to the Egyptians, there is little doubt that it was the Turco-Egyptian era which promoted Sudan to the international trade in the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, the Sudanese experienced an era of a cash economy. Even Egyptian currency was introduced and became operational in Sudan. Also, the interior of Sudan was open to the outside world. Indeed, some of the Arabic-speaking groups living in the Nile Valley became quite prosperous through their involvement in the considerable shipping traffic that developed on the river. Others became even wealthy by partaking in the slave and ivory trades in the southern Sudan. The nomadic tribes supplied camels and other domestic animals which, after slaves and ivory, formed the main exports of Sudan. Another impact had to do with the development of agriculture. Egyptian administrators and expatiators were sent to Sudan to teach the Sudanese new farming techniques. They even introduced and established African history, the Madhi state, and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. The Turco-Egyptian administration also witnessed the establishment of the provincial boundaries in Sudan. Muhammad Ali established Egyptian government headquarters at Khartoum in 1824. The rest of the Sudan was divided into provinces, each under a governor who was responsible to the Governor-General at Khartoum, the latter being responsible to the ruler in Cairo. The administrative divisions have been accused of causing the internal divisions aimed at administrative efficiency the policy implementers did whatever was possible to avoid social unity. They forbade local relations and injured the whole unity process by making one area attack or raid another. Muhammad Ahmed the Mahdi. He was born in 1844 in Dagol province to a family of boat builders. As a young man, Ahmed received education in Islamic law and theology at the feet of a famous learned man Sheikh Taib. He was an eager scholar and soon became a faqih, that is, a man learned in Islamic law. He became a powerful member of the Samani Brotherhood. At the age of 17 years, Muhammad was already an eloquent preacher. As a result, many converts converged around him and they were to become his powerful force in his mission of creating an ideal Islamic society. Like other contemporary Islamic religious reformers, Muhammad Ahmed dreamt of a return to the ideal Islamic government that was believed to have existed in the days of the first four Muslim caliphs. He hoped to see the whole Islamic world reunited under a righteous ruler who would strictly govern it in accordance with the sacred teachings of the Quran. Muhammad preached against the luxury and corruption of the times and called for a return to the purity and spiritual state of an ideal Islamic life. He saw the Turks as ungodly and corrupt. He condemned the Sudanese Sheikhs for their lax and luxurious way of life and their acceptance of offices under the Turco-Egyptian regime. He began to see himself as a heaven-sent deliverer destined to rule the entire Muslim community and restore it to godliness and purity. In 1881, his followers proclaimed him as the Madhi, the Guided One. Due to his relentless attack on the social, political and economic conditions that were affecting the Sudanese under the unjust Turco-Egyptian rule, Muhammad won a big number of masses who rallied behind him. When he strongly attacked the ungodly nature and lax life, he attracted a band of fanatic Muslims. The non-Muslims also won due to the relevancy of Mahdi's message. There were the Jalian and the Danicola boatmen and traders who joined the Mahdi not out of Islamic zeal but because of the heavy taxation and abolition of slave trade from which they had greatly benefited. The Bakar nomads also joined because they complained of heavy taxation. All these groups saw in the Mahdi a man who would champion their causes and lead their redemption. African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Another group comprised of people who had been economically threatened by the Turco-Egyptian attempt to abolish slave trade in the Sudan. The most affected were the northern tribes, the Ja'alin and the Danicola. These were neither theologians nor devoted Muslims but used the religious umbrella as a vehicle to achieve their political and economic interests. Thus, under the banner of religion, these merchants united behind the Mahdi in the hope of recapturing their old position as slave traders. The third group comprised of the cattle-keeping nomads of Kordofan and Darfur. The Bakar nomads disliked political control by any settled government. They were also unhappy with the paying of high taxes to the Turco-Egyptian administration. When the Mahdi appeared, these Bakar interpreted him as a sign of hope towards tax reform. With the massive support and the proclamation of Muhammad Ahmed as the Mahdi, the Turco-Egyptian government was alarmed and so he was summoned to Khartoum. He defied the summons and in retaliation an expedition was sent against him which he defeated. This first defeat of the Turco-Egyptian forces was a blessing to the Mahdists. The victory news spread rapidly among the masses that Allah had fought on the side of the Mahdi and that the Mahdi had defeated the enemies without much military effort but with only stones and clubs against guns. With the news, support for the Mahdists grows rapidly. Soon the support had to overrun the Turco-Egyptian forces. Muhammad Ahmed conducted his campaign according to Islamic ideals modelled on the life of Prophet Muhammad. He began by performing a hera, that is a holy fight from the ungodly, a flight that was akin to Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina. The hera took the Mahdi to Kordofan in the west where most of his supporters were to be found. In Kordofan and neighbouring Darfur, the Mahdi won several military successes, and then began to extend his power eastward. By 1883 he was not only ruling over Kordofan and Darfur but was also master of the areas around the Blue Nile. Osman Digna governed the eastern part on behalf of the Mahdi. At that time, the Turco-Egyptian administration was in a particularly weak position following the British occupation of Egypt in 1882. Thus, in 1883 the British decided to support the puppet regime in Egypt in a bid to restore a Turco-Egyptian army to capture the Mahdi in Kordofan. Hick's expedition was decisively defeated and the Sudanese interpreted the victory as another miracle and sign that Ahmed was really the Mahdi. Consequently, many Sudanese hesitated no more to rally behind the Mahdi. In 1883 an official decision was taken by the British government to evacuate the Sudan and leave it to the Mahdi. Thus, General Charles George Gordon, ex-governor of the Equatorial Province, was dispatched by the British government to Khartoum in order to evacuate the Egyptian soldiers and administrators as the Mahdists were apparently gaining an upper hand over the Egyptians. Gordon arrived in February 1884 and quickly realised that a peaceful evacuation wasn't possible. Gordon then blundered by defying the orders given to him and decided to smash the Mahdi. Gordon's forces were far too small for the advancing massive following of Muhammad Ahmed and he found himself cut off and besieged in Khartoum. On January 25, 1885, Khartoum fell to the Mahdist, and by the end of the fighting, Gordon was dead. The relief expedition that had been reluctantly sent by Gladstone, the British Prime Minister under General Waltley, arrived 2 days after the death of Gordon. Unprepared to push on, the expedition just retreated, leaving the Mahdi in full control over a greater part of the former Turco-Egyptian Sudan. The Mahdi then sent himself the task of establishing his theocratic state. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ahmed did. African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. His reign, he minted silver and gold coins. He appointed 3 deputies or caliphs to help him in his campaigns, that is Abdullahi, Ali and Muhammad Sharif. After his death, Abdullahi succeeded him to the supreme position in Sudan. Effects of the Mahdist Revolt. The triumph of the Mahdist had several consequences. Firstly, the victory marked an end to the Turco-Egyptian control over the Sudan. This also meant an end to the exploitation and corruption that characterized the 65 years of Turco-Egyptian control. Ultimately, the Sudanese regained their sovereignty under the leader Muhammad Ahmed the Mahdi. The purification of Sudanese society was also evidenced. The Mahdist state that was established by Muhammad Ahmed was a theocratic one based on pure Islamic principles. The Mahdi collected only taxes as laid down in the Quran. He also purified society by administering several punishments on theft, adultery, drunkenness, and smoking, and on the bringing of false accusations. He also successfully enforced the law of women wearing veils. Another effect of the war is that a firm foundation for future Sudanese nationalism was laid. Indeed, many scholars argue that Muhammad Ahmed is the father of modern Sudanese nationalism. This is based on the fact that although the Sudanese rose in a Mahdist revolt for social, political, and economic injustices, the idea of nationalism geared at regaining lost sovereignty was strong. Moreover, the government that was established after had some results that were a pure indication of Sudanese nationalism. The Mahdist revolt also led to massive destruction of life and property. The several Turco-Egyptian expeditions and later British expeditions that were sent against the Mahdi were defeated with several human losses. Indeed, some striking personalities such as Charles Gordon were a casualty of the struggle. Additionally, the revolt triggered off increased British interest in the reconquest of the Sudan. The death of Charles George Gordon in 1885 in the hands of the jihadists provided the British with a good excuse for the later colonization of the Sudan in 1898. The British argued that they wanted to avenge the death of Charles Gordon. The rebellion also ended with direct European involvement in the administration of Sudan. Under the Turco-Egyptians, and especially in the reign of Khedive Ismail Pasha, Europeans like Emin Pasha, Samuel Bacon, and Gordon were instrumental in the administration of Sudan. However, the anti-European campaign that climaxed in the death of Charles Gordon on 1885 meant that direct European control of the Sudan had to be stopped. Heavy taxation and the brutal means of its tax collection that had characterized the Turco-Egyptian rule in the Sudan came to a halt. The Mahdi collected the taxes that were chronically prescribed, even when taxes were. African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Muhammad Ahmed the Mahdi used a number of ways to win the support of the Sudanese for his movement. First, the Mahdi capitalized on the considerable Sudanese discontent with the Turco-Egyptian regime. In this way, he drew together in one revolt people with different grievances and aims. The Mahdi also promised a renewed social and political order. Through his activities and propaganda, the Mahdi preached against the luxury of the times. He called for a return to the purity and ideal Islamic life of self-denial and self-discipline. He strongly condemned lax life and promised a better social and political order. By so doing, he created hope in the population, thereby winning them over for revolt. Additionally, Muhammad Ahmed captured the support of many by declaring himself the Mahdi, that is the guided one not only for Sudan but of the whole world. Indeed, the letters he dispatched in June 1881 to the Sudanese notable, Muhammad claimed that he was the divine leader chosen by God to fill the earth with justice and equality. Many therefore followed him in his revolt, believing that he was God sent. Islam was also used to enhance the unity of most Sudanese. Islam defined most of the Sudanese as one class or territory fighting against the oppression of the Turco-Egyptians. Many Sudanese had the same cultural background and identity in Islam and therefore were easily won over by the Mahdi for revolt. In spite of the fact that the Mahdi was a pious Muslim, he did not discriminate against the non-Muslims. It was this willingness and acceptance of people of any class, religions and grievance in his movement that encouraged many to join. If the Mahdi had discriminated against the non-Muslims, it's possible that the other people would have not joined the revolt, or they would have supported the Turco-Egyptian. Such a phenomenon would have indeed stripped the revolt of valuable supporters. The presence of a revolutionary army with people able and willing to use force to attain their objectives also aided the Mahdi to rally to the people behind his movement. Indeed, almost immediately after 1820's Muhammad Ali's conquest of the Sudan, there were revolts, also uprisings in Darfur against the new administration. In 1838 and 1878, and in Barbarossa in 1877 and 1878. The emergence of Mohammed Ahmed therefore found a population already charged with the spirit of revolt, and that way he won easy supporters. The Mahdi's earlier victories military were also a means through which he won more followers. For example, when the Mahdi proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the Egyptian government dispatched an expedition against him which he defeated his enemies without military effort. Support for him grew rapidly. This support soon became overwhelming for the government forces to contain. Later victories also had similar effects. In 1883, when a main Egyptian army led by an English commander Hicks Pasha was decisively defeated, the Sudanese interpreted the victory as another miracle and a sign that Mohammed Ahmed really was the Mahdi and no longer. African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Caliph Abdullah's reign has been described differently by different historians. Some European writers describe his reign as one of the unrelieved brutality and barbarism and refer to him as a great dictator, murderer and cruel administrator of the time. Recent research, however, shows that Abdullah's reign was a remarkably successful system. From the onset, Abdullah's reign was faced with many internal and external problems. Internally, his ethnic background as a Bakara proved a liability to him in his early years of rule. To make matters worse, members of the Mahdi's own family, the Ashraf, felt that they should hold the highest offices in the land. The Mahdi's kinsman Caliph Muhammad Sharif and his followers, the Ashraf, attempted to coup in 1886 but were defeated, disarmed and incorporated into the forces loyal to Abdullah. Again in 1891, the Ashraf sought the help of the Danaklah and settlers in the Jazeera area to overthrow Abdullah on grounds that he was not from the Mahdi's lineage. Caliph Abdullah combined diplomacy with force and eventually they were defeated. Also during Mohammed Ahmed's short reign, he had embarked on many political and religious reforms. By virtue of his claim as the Mahdi, Mohammed Ahmed had denounced all the traditional schools of the Islamic world and prepared his own code. Those moves were naturally unpopular among the more conservative learned men and leaders of the powerful Sufi group formerly Amazon in the country. These reforms were much more difficult to maintain when the Mahdi himself died. He had united the people against foreign domination, but once the hated foreign regime was gone and the Mahdi died, traditional ethnic hostilities were soon renewed. A more serious source of trouble to Caliph Abdullahi was the attempt by some of the central government control a form of seceding. Most groups felt that they had united in revolt in 1881–1885 in order to overthrow the hated Turco-Egyptians. After this, the Bakara, Denekala and Rijalim wanted to remain independent. The Caliph had to resort to excess use of force to silence such tendencies. Abdullah's own ethnic group, the Bakara nomads, were among the most difficult to handle, especially those from Darfur. Although he finally settled this by forming a good number of them to leave Darfur and settle in Omdurman, this nevertheless continued to be a problem in his reign. First, the transfer of Calipha's kinsmen, the Taisha of the Bakara, to Omdurman continued to contribute to worsening of the food crisis for these people who had been moved to Omdurman had to be fed. Moreover, the arrival of thousands of Taisha caused considerable annoyance among the other settled supporters of the Caliph. In foreign policy, Caliph Abdullah attempted to complete the task left by Mohammed Ahmed. That was the task of promoting the Holy War to the Christian Ethiopian Empire and to Egypt that still had unreformed Islam on the eastern frontier lay Ethiopia. As a religious leader, the Caliph was thought he was duty-bound to make war against the Christian infidels, and a jihad was declared on Ethiopia. Sudanese forces invaded Ethiopia in 1889, but were severely defeated at the Battle of Metemma. The Ethiopian Emperor John Roman IV was killed by a stray bullet. This even had to trigger off continued Ethiopian hostility even in the period of Menelik Roman II. There was also the Egyptian question. Although the British government had at first decided on a policy of non-intervention in the Sudan, the Egyptian rulers had not abandoned hope of recovering the territory. A large section of the Egyptian army was stationed near Aswan, not far from the Sudanese northern frontier. This forced the Caliph to maintain a large army in preparedness for an attack. In 1889, he took an initiative and invaded Egypt. After all, also Egypt had unreformed Islam. But at this moment, the Caliph had probably bitten more than he could swallow, for the Mahdist forces were badly defeated at Tastiki by the Anglo-Egyptian troops. By about 1892, Abdullah had failed in his foreign policy, though he had succeeded in making significant progress. African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881–1885 in Sudan. Group. Indeed, by the 1890s, the nature of Caliph Abdullah's reign had become too dictatorial and personal rule of sorts. He was brutal in most of his action and built an army that he used to suppress any form of opposition. The attempt to purify society in accordance with Islamic beliefs, which had been such a marked feature of the Mahdist society policy, was continued, and a high moral tone was maintained in the administration, where corruption was severely punished. Taxes were made much lighter and more honestly collected than in the Turco-Egyptian regime, and people paid them more willingly. The Caliph also maintained a large army which was provided by firearms, some captured from defeated enemies and others made in Omdurman. Unfortunately, due to his ambitious territorial expansion programs, the Caliph recruited a very big army that drained the Sudanese resources to the neglect of the economic field. With time, military expeditions led to various financial constraints, and heads Abdullahi had to increase taxes. To make matters worse, this was the time when the Sudanese currency was debased in value due to inflation. Food shortages had set in and food prices skyrocketed. All those problems accelerated opposition against him. Noteworthy is that Abdullah's regime was marred by tribalism and nepotism. In an attempt to safeguard his position, Abdullah employed his kinsmen in the most sensitive areas of government, such as the army. This temporarily solved his internal problems, but also triggered off resentment from some groups because they had been left out. Caliph Abdullah also proved to be a very harsh ruler. His punishments for trivial cases were severe. He made matters worse by isolating himself from the rest of the people from 1892 onwards. He no longer appeared weekly at Friday prayer, and he only surfaced 4 times a year. A great wall was built around the section of Omdurman where he lived. He thus lost touch with his people and lost their support. His senior advisors were his brothers Yaqub and his eldest son Uthman. To aggravate the situation, the Caliph continued his predecessor's policy of moving and resettling people within Sudan. This policy took different ethnic groups from one part of the country to another where such ethnic groups were not used to. Consequently, most immigrants were unproductive in their new homes and so had to be fed by the government, thereby worsening the famine situation. In spite of the weakness, however, Abdullah's rule was marked by a transformation of the Mahdist state from a theocracy into a complex and centralized administrative unit. In the last decade of the 19th century, there were imperialist designs of several European powers interested in the Upper Nile, a problem the Caliph had to face. The French, for instance, were interested in linking their West African colonies Senegal and their possessions in Equatorial Africa to the Red Sea. The Germans were heading towards Caliphate state from Uganda and Kenya, the Italians from the Red Sea coast, while Menelik Roman II was from Cecil. Rhodes in South Africa, who chorused a dream of linking Cairo to the Cape by transcontinental railway and telegraph system. The Egyptians in the north were also interested in retaking the Sudan. Until 1894, the British had taken little interest in the events occurring in the Sudan. But in 1896, the French explorer Major J.B. Merchant set out from the Upper Congo and reached Fashoda on the Nile. Such a move by the French had been dreaded by the British since the 1882 Egyptian affair. The French were now not only going to be dangerous proximity to the Nile, but were likely to advance dangerously towards Egypt from the south. Something had to be done, and done quickly. A British military expedition was therefore dispatched under Lord Kitchener. This expedition met the French expedition at Fashoda and the two African history, the Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881-1885 in Sudan. Mahdist state that had disintegrated, and it was not until 1956 that the Sudanese again regained their independence. Why the Mahdist state disintegrated? By 1898, the Mahdist state that had been founded by Muhammad Ahmed in 1885 was no more. The disintegration of this once mighty state had been a consequence of internal and external factors. Internally, the death of the Mahdi in June 1885 had left Sudan with internal division, succession struggles and civil confusion down to 1890s. The Caliph, for instance, constantly struggled with Muhammad Ahmed's kinsmen the Ashraf for recognition. The Ashraf particularly found it difficult to shift their loyalty to the new ruler, the Caliph, and hence became a thorn in the back of his administration. Such internal conflict weakened the bonds of unity which the Mahdi had created, thereby making the Sudan prone to any external advance should it occur. The Mahdist state was also destined to collapse due to the very nature of the people who composed the Mahdi's revolutionary army. These composed of the Jalian, the Danakil and the Bakkara nomads. After overthrowing the Turco-Egyptian administration, many of these remained either aloof or kept their original status, avoiding any hand of the administrators, refusing to pay taxes and careful to avoid the law and the long hand of justice. Consequently, these groups became a problem to the state. It can be stated therefore that the collapse of the Mahdist state was partly due to the fact that the very founders did not continue to support it through. There was lack of internal unity in the state. Thus many sections of the Sudanese were opposed to the Caliphate's administration, thus undermining its existence. These included the Bakkara, the Danakil and the Ashraf. Coupled with the above is that Caliphate's administration turned out to be corrupt, inefficient and autocratic. For instance, the Caliphate started off well with good and capable officers in the charge of the treasury. However, he ended up dismissing them. A striking example was Ibrahim Muhammad, an excellent administrator whom the Caliphate dismissed in 1890 and replaced with less capable individuals. This also robbed the regime of valuable supporters. Also, by the late 19th century, the Sudanese army had become relatively weak due to lack of equipment and discipline. Thus, it wasn't able to stand foreign conquest, more so the more organized Anglo-Egyptian forces in 1898. The economy of the Mahdists was also weak and had virtually collapsed by the late 1890s. Agricultural output had fallen due to a combination of high taxation and bad weather. There were also high inflation and low levels of commerce. The Caliphate never encouraged trade with Sudan's neighbours because of the intensive wars with Ethiopia and Egypt. All these facts meant that the economy was weak to support any meaningful projects as to African history. The Madhi state and the Mahdist Revolt of 1881-1885 in Sudan. Caliphate Abdullah himself was partly to blame for the demise of the Mahdist state. He became too much of a jihadist and an internal Islamic reformer. In his activities, the Caliphate exercised excessive power, more so in legal matters. Apart from affecting heavy punishments for trivial cases, the Caliphate also insisted on strict regulations on drinking, smoking, and adultery. In addition, he insisted that women must be veiled and were not to go to markets or public streets. These strict laws left out some people and made the public to detest Caliphate's administration, some of them even expressing their anger and revolt. Externally, Sudan lacked support from her neighbours such as Egypt and Sudan. These two had in fact been turned into arch-enemies due to the Caliphate's expansionist jihads in the days of his rule. In fact, even Ethiopia signed a treaty with Britain that helped the British to isolate and defeat the Sudan. Besides, France, which was quite friendly to Sudan, was an enemy of Britain and later actually feared its presence.